you, Terry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your sort of graveyard slot behind after lunch, so I'll try and keep it light and entertaining, but see how we go. So I had a great subject, and I've done these talking slots. One of the best subjects you can ever be given, is talk about what you think the future's going to hold, because it's just wonderful to think about. But I think I can guarantee a few things. Some of which I say won't come to pass, some of which I say might come to pass. So we shall see. Let's have a bit of fun and see what comes up from it. So I thought perhaps just before I look at the future, let's just remind ourselves of how we got to where we are today. And I thought it might be fun just to think about the kind of evolution of DC. So not many of you probably remember, but back in the 1990s, money purchase, as it was known then, soon became defined contribution, but money purchase was born in its modern form, with lots of employers obviously closing their defined benefit schemes or final salary schemes to new entrants. So DC was born. Generally on day one it had no members and no assets, and it's moved on from then. Then if you remember a few years later, we got the advent of stakeholder pensions, which was quite a big landmark in the evolution of this, particularly around costs, and this kind of theme will come back. Life cycle was invented, or lifestyle investment was invented back then as well, in those early days. Then sort of it grew up a little bit, maybe into toddler stage of life in around the mid-1990s. Got a bit of a boost in the arm when obviously we've got final salary schemes beginning to close to future accrual. So all of a sudden a big boost in membership, big boost in assets. We're beginning to get a little bit of noise and guidance out of the pensions regulator around DC at the time. Obviously auto-enrolment came along, as we all know and love, a few years ago. And many trustee boards began to recognise that they weren't spending enough time on DC. And I remember a number of trustee boards beginning to set up separate DC subcommittees to focus on them and to move away from that traditional model where DC was sort of 2 minutes at the end of a long agenda. So we started getting some more focus on DC. That boosted us into the next stage, which is where we are today. Perhaps a teenager or adolescent, perhaps is the best way to describe where we are in terms of DC. And what's happening now? Well, as we all know, freedom and choice reforms coming in any day now. Obviously, we've got some stuff around the command paper, around charge caps, and so forth, cleaning up some of the industry, a little bit focused around that. And obviously, the code of practice and the minimum governance standards coming in from the regulator and legislation as well. So, as you can see, beginning to build, beginning to focus, beginning to drive up the quality and the size of DC schemes. And I guess the challenge then is, what's it going to look like in 5 years' time when DC maybe becomes let's say kind of early 20s, a kind of a young adult. Still lots and lots of potential, lots and lots of growth, lots and lots of development still required. But DC is growing up and growing up fast as we do that. But I think probably in a relatively immature state still today. So what are the challenges that we face? And I won't go through all of these, but you can read them yourself. What are some of the challenges we face? Clearly, the whole subject of member engagement and understanding is clearly a massive challenge and continues to be a massive challenge. The whole issue about operating costs, operating scale, continues to be a massive challenge. We've got charge caps, we've got huge focus on costs and value for money to the member, and achieving realistic and sensible operating costs is a big challenge for us in DC. I think we'll still suffer from a negative brand. I think most people still see DC as a bit of a poor quality, a poor relation. I think that doesn't help, so we've got to do something about that. That's one of the big challenges. Just frankly, keeping up with legislative change, I think is probably a fair challenge at the moment in terms of everything that's coming through as well. And maybe the last one I'll talk about is benefit adequacy. So I think it's kind of a challenge maybe we haven't spent enough time thinking about or talking about. The simple reality is today, the vast majority of people retiring from a DC scheme will not have anywhere near enough money to have a sensible level of income in retirement. Benefit adequacy is a big challenge that I think we haven't already begun to think about or begin to tackle, but it's there. So anyway, many others, and I'll touch on a few as we go through. I guess in looking at the next 5 years, though, I think I've sort of brought out 3 themes that I wanted to touch on. And I think these 3 themes will probably define, in many respects, the evolution and the change that we're going to see over the next 5 years. I think, generally, if I was invited back in 5 years' time to come and talk a little bit around where DC has got to, I actually think DC will be quite unrecognisable from where it is today. I genuinely think it'll be quite unrecognisable from where it is today. So let me talk about some of the themes as to what that is and why that's changing. There are three areas I said I want to talk about. One is the subject of, and it touches on the individual member and member engagement, but the subject of personalisation. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in a second. But DC is about the individual. And I think there's a lot of change that's going to happen around driving that focus around the individual. Raising the governance bar. So I'm sure you're all aware there's been a momentum building on this anyway around the fact that there is not enough and there is not a good quality level of governance generally being applied to DC schemes across the country. There's a lot of focus on driving up the governance bar. There will continue to be, and I'll talk a little bit more around that, but I think that will drive a lot of change over the next few years. And then perhaps that issue of operating costs, operating scale, and touched on a little bit of governance as well. I think the growth of master trusts is something that I'm sure you're all seeing, you're all hearing. It's been growing momentum over the last 18 months. It's a huge groundswell of change, and I just wanted to touch and give you some observations and thoughts on that subject. So let me start with personalisation. So I guess for going right back to those early days, I talked about when the birth of DC. So I remember I was a young consultant in those days, talking and helping clients and employers setting up and running DC schemes or money purchase schemes. And I remember in those days it was quite difficult really to get our clients too excited because they were sitting there going, but hang on a minute, there's going to be no members and no assets in this scheme. Why do I need to spend very much thinking about it? And it was a bit of a challenge, really. But the reality is, in those days, actually, it didn't really matter too much because, as I said, the membership was small, assets were small, nobody would need to worry. But over the recent years, it's becoming blatantly obvious, I think, to all of us that the simple reality is everybody is different. Everybody in this room is different. Everybody outside is different. And yet we're trying to create a scheme or a structure or choices that everybody is going to follow. And the reality is, the use of default has been a big theme of the growth of DC to date. I think, and I've been questioning for some time now, the reality of does a default really work when you're actually talking about hundreds of people, let alone thousands of people that we've got. The reality is, what was announced last March in the budget, what's coming into effect any day now, just simply blows away any pretense at all that a default is appropriate, to my mind. Individuals now need to personalise what they are doing, where they are going, and the journey they're taking, if you like, towards retirement. Particularly in a post-retirement world, no longer clearly is everybody heading to the same place. Everybody's heading completely differently. And you can see here just an illustration of the way we like to think about retirement now for people. So when people retire, they're facing probably three needs. A need to secure a basic level of income, a need, or certainly a want, to have a little bit more than that and maybe secure a home comfort level of income. And then maybe if you're really lucky, you might have a little bit left over to provide some luxuries in life. And the reality is actually, how much money people have got, whether they've got enough, what minimum survival means to people, what home comforts mean to people is going to be different. And so, the reality is we've got to help people begin to personalise and understand they're doing. People are doing this outside of pensions. People are personalising their lives, personalising their choices, personalising what they're doing all the time. And yet we seem to be unable to do it at the moment, really, in the world of pensions. So we've got to tackle that. We've got to deal with that. So let's think about this for a second. So, in the old world, I think things were quite binary, black and white. We had, on the one hand, passive savers, people who frankly, doesn't matter what you do, what you say, just simply won't make a decision and will always follow the path of least resistance. We've got those small and often vocal group of people who are the independent choice makers, people who will make free choice and like to understand and hopefully are reasonably well informed about what they're doing. And that's it, really. That's kind of all we've recognised, and the simple reality is you tend to have maybe 5% of your population sitting in the independent choice maker box and maybe about 95% of the population sitting in the passive saver box. I'd like to propose that there is a middle group. Okay, there's a group we haven't really thought about, recognised, but an incredibly important middle group. And actually, I'd like to suggest that actually that middle group is by far the largest population in your membership. A group that I call limited personalisers. Okay, so they're personalisers. They're not making sophisticated decisions, investment decisions. They're simply saying, I am this kind of person, this is my lifestyle, this is my needs, that's what I want. Okay, they're making lifestyle-based personalisation decisions in a limited way. So we're not giving them huge amounts of choice, huge amounts of complexity. We're making it very, very easy, very, very simple to enable these people to tailor what they're doing to their own situation and circumstances. I think that's an incredibly important population. And what do we got to do? And I won't delve into too much about how we deal with this group, but I think let me just say two things. One is there are two tools at your disposal. Okay, you have the design of the scheme and the choices. If you design the choices appropriately to people, you give people some limited, simple choices that are explained around lifestyle needs, and you then provide the support and the guidance and the information to people to enable them to use those choices, then you've cracked this particular challenge. Okay, but to date we've had some fairly complex designs and we've done some fairly complex communications. We've got to focus that and we've got to use those two tools. Those are the tools you've got. And I've seen it work. If you design it well, you design your choices well, you provide the right support and guidance to people, you can get them to personalise. I've seen it, and we've got to make this work. We've got to do that. And I think we're going to see more, as I said, over the few years around that one. So that's really what I wanted to talk about that. Let's think about member-centric design. Okay, when you're thinking, when you're making choices, when you're designing your investment strategy, for example, when you're designing how you're going to communicate to your members, are you basing it upon a real knowledge of the population that you're designing it for? Okay, and it's not a flippant question. Do you really understand the membership of the scheme that you're looking after? Do you really understand what they need, what they want, how they behave? Have you segmented that population? Have you thought about how the different groups, how many different groups you've got within that, how you can design and cater for those different groups? It's quite a sophisticated exercise, but actually, again, it's not new. If you think outside pensions for a while, this is how people work. This is how product marketing works. When people design and make washing powder or cars, they don't just make it in a back room and then go onto the street and go, right, does anybody want one of these? They've got a target marketing audience. They know what people want and they've designed it to that population. So all I'm saying is let's be smart. Let's use some of these techniques in the way that we design and run pension schemes, because DC is about the individual. Okay, so let's talk a little bit around governance. So, and you'll be familiar, I'm sure, with what's been going on. Hopefully you're all familiar with the minimum standards that are coming in. But let's again just talk a little bit around kind of the direction and the change here. So the pensions regulator has had a bit of a mantra, the 3 E's. The regulators always talked about they educate, they enable, and they enforce. Okay, now frankly from a DC point of view, to date, they've pretty much focused on the first couple. So they've educated and they've tried to enable. And if I'm honest with you, that's partly because actually the kind of tools they've got, the powers they have, didn't really enable them to do much more than that. But that's what they did, and they've done a lot, I'm sure, by producing guidance, best practice, and lots of stuff, some of which has been adopted, some of which hasn't. But the simple reality is the regulator now has the tools and the appetite and the focus to enforce. Okay, this isn't just me saying that, you can ask them, they will tell you this. They are now going to focus much more on enforcement. Okay, the minimum governance standards coming into effect give them the ability to now start enforcing good quality governance. Okay, the bar has now raised dramatically in the field of governance, and it will continue to do so. Okay. There's lots and lots of stuff out there that's telling you what good governance is about, and the simple reality is a lot of that is now becoming less of an optional. This is now becoming more and more mandatory. So if you're a trustee of a DC pension scheme, the simple reality is your job, I'm sure you realise, is a lot harder today than it was. Going forward, it's going to be a lot harder still going forward. And I think there's some challenges, because the reality, let's go back, DC is still, as I said, a bit of an adolescent. It's still quite immature and undeveloped. So the reality is a lot of this stuff that's coming through, and the regulator and the legislation is saying in minimum governance, actually, what does it really mean? So how do you actually explain and be comfortable that your members are getting value for money? How do you do that? Okay, it talks about knowledge and understanding. It talks about making sure that the people have relevant skills and expertise. Okay, that is a long way further forward from the old TKU. You know, it's not enough to just go, I went online and I did the sort of the governance toolkit. You know, I'm fine. You know, the whole thing has moved on. So if you read what's going on there, you think about what's going on there, the reality is actually the scope of your role is now significantly improving over the next few years, and some real challenges I'd suggest around that, not least of which because actually, you know, the reality is a lot of this is new around how you really apply this. So, you know, all I'll say is, you know, make sure you're up for the challenge, because challenge is definitely what you're going to be facing. Let me touch on the third point. So I think it's linked a little bit to that governance message, but it's also probably linked more to the whole issue of scale, and operational scale and value for money for members and so on and so forth. And we've seen a significant growth in the field of master trusts. I think some research I've seen predicts in the next few years something like 25% or 30% of members of pension schemes will be in a master trust vehicle. You know, that's rapid from virtually nothing. You know, a couple of years ago, that's huge growth. You know, so this is about schemes that are employers that have decided they no longer want to run their own trust-based pension scheme. You know, for one reason or another, they don't feel it's appropriate to continue to do that. But equally, they don't feel that necessarily going to the other extreme of saying to the individual member, right, you're out there on your own, go and take an insurance policy and leave it at that. You know, there's a groundswell of a middle ground. You've still got the inbuilt strength of governance. You've got all of that, but you've got it in a sort of slightly distant vehicle in terms of a master trust. And I challenge people, I think this is a conversation that many of my clients are debating with themselves, is what is the right vehicle? Strategically, what is the right vehicle for my three groups of members? My active employees, if you like, you know, what's the right vehicle for them? People who no longer work for me, so the inactive savers, as I call them, people who no longer work for me. Do I really want to be spending my time, my money, my energy looking after people that no longer work for me? Question mark. And what about people who are now at a stage of beginning to take their money out of the savings vehicle? Do you want to be looking after those within your scheme, or actually is there another vehicle you want to be using for those? So I'll challenge you and say, you know, you too should be thinking about those three groups of members and thinking about strategically, from your point of view, what do you want to be doing in relation to those three types of members? What's the best vehicle for them, and what's the best vehicle for you around those? And I think, you know, as I said, in 5 years' time, I could well be standing here and saying the simple reality is actually there's half a dozen master trusts in this country that frankly dominate the vast majority of active saving in this world. So anyway, that's my thoughts. I think, you know, the driver here is very much for smaller schemes, you know, to clear out a lot of smaller schemes. The regulator, you know, again, is quite open about saying, as far as they're concerned, they want to govern a small number of big schemes. Where they are is governing a large number of small schemes. That makes it very, very difficult for them. So they'd rather shift that balance entirely. So anyway, let me just wrap up and give some summaries. So the reality is DC will outgrow DB. Probably not quite there yet, but in the next few years, frankly, it will outgrow DB in terms of size. DC is about scale. That's the only way you get efficiencies and the costs come down. And it is about world-class governance. Be under no illusions, the expectation is only if there is world-class governance in place, frankly, will the scheme be able to survive. The question that you've got is, do you feel you are up to performing world-class governance, or do you want to pass that on to somebody else? Innovation will come. We have seen some innovation to date, but I think we'll see a lot more over the next 5 years. A lot more innovation over the next 5 years. Technology clearly will play a major part, particularly coming back to this point about personalisation. Technology is a real, huge enabler to deliver personalisation. You know, retirement savings, you know, already beginning to talk about more holistic savings, you know, and it will form a part of a more integrated benefits and rewards program. So, you know, I think, you know, employers will be sitting here in 5 years' time saying, I don't necessarily offer my employees a pension scheme anymore. I offer them a savings option. And that savings option will have different vehicles within it. It'll have short-term, long-term, medium-term savings options within it. And the things that we know and love today as pension schemes will simply be one of those options in a broader picture. And I think the final point is, you know, is a challenge for each one of you here, is you need to go away and seriously think about what the right strategic option is for your membership or your employees, your active employees, your inactive or deferred or ex-employees, and the people retiring. What's the right vehicle? What's the right strategic response given everything that's happening to what you want to do? And that's not saying by any means that you shouldn't continue to run a trust-based scheme by any means whatsoever. It's simply saying that if you decide that's the vehicle you want to route, then accept and understand what that means in terms of the role that you've got to play, the risks that you're going to face in undertaking that role. Okay.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.